Today we're going to be talking about covalent bonds. Covalent bonding occurs when two atoms are sharing a pair of electrons. Atoms share their electrons in order to fill up their valence shell and complete the octet rule of having 8 electrons. Covalent bonds can most often be found between nonmetal and nonmetal atoms, but they can also occur between nonmetal and metal atoms, but it's just not as common. When atoms bond, they can form up to 3 bonds with the electrons that they share. For each bond formed, 2 electrons are being used. Usually in covalent bonds, the electrons between the 2 atoms are not shared equally, but it can happen. The atom with the highest electronegativity will pull the electrons closer to itself. When electrons aren't shared equally, it's called a polar covalent bond, but when they are shared equally, it's called a nonpolar covalent bond. Compounds that are covalently bonded tend to have low boiling and melting points. Covalent compounds are poor conductors of electricity, and they often do not dissolve well in water. Now we are going to look at polar covalent bonds in more detail. Like I said earlier, the atom with the highest electronegativity has the highest attraction to the electron, and will therefore pull the electrons closer to itself. When 2 atoms have a polar covalent bond between them, a partial positive and a partial negative charge are created. The atom with the higher electronegativity will have the partial negative charge because it is pulling the electrons closer to itself and therefore creating the unequal charge. Molecules with polar covalent bonds can also create hydrogen bonds because of their uneven distribution of charges. The other type of covalent bond that we are going to talk about is a nonpolar covalent bond. In a nonpolar covalent bond, the electrons are shared equally between the atoms. This occurs when the atoms have similar electron affinities. An atom's electron affinity is the atom's ability to gain an electron. If the electron affinity of the atoms is close to equal, then neither of the atoms is pulling on the electrons more than the other, and therefore they share the electrons equally. Unlike polar covalent molecules, nonpolar covalent molecules do not create a partial negative and a partial positive charge, and therefore they often have a charge of 0. Nonpolar covalent bonds are most often found between atoms of the same element because their electron affinities are the same. But it isn't impossible for these bonds to occur between atoms of different elements. To summarize what we've gone over, a covalent bond occurs between atoms that are sharing electrons. Atoms create these bonds in order to fill their electron shell and gain stability. In a polar covalent bond, the electrons are shared inequally, but in a nonpolar covalent bond, the electrons are shared equally. And lastly, atoms can create up to 3 bonds between themselves. Each bond accounts for 2 electrons. That's all you need to know about covalent bonds. Thanks for watching.